all these fiat systems eventually die in a storm of inflation. 90% chance that we see the end of the euro in the next 20 years. The industrial base of Europe is thoroughly undermined, and so the pain is starting to increase, and it's almost, I'm afraid it's going to increase almost exponentially. Like it's going to be like that graph in Weimar Germany where things seem normal. Even close to the beginning of the hyperinflation, things seemed pretty normal. And then all of a sudden it went really fast, because it's just how going bankrupt works. Like once the trust is lost, then it goes very fast. This is just like, in the 1700s, late 1700s, first you had hyperinflation with the assignats in France, and then you had the French Revolution. I'm waiting for inflation first, and then there's going to be big changes. The stock markets expressed in commodities are in a, not even recession, are in a depression. It has already begun. I want to say at least 5 years of pain, maybe 7, of stagflation at least, right? High inflation, stagnation, but more likely an economic depression.
Welcome to the Microscopic Podcast presented by Gold Republic. My name is Alexei Joranov, and in this format I invite you to look at the world through different lenses, to see what's hidden in plain sight. We'll dive deep to understand the forces that drive macroeconomics, financial markets, and the emergence of a new monetary system with sound money like gold, silver, and digital assets like Bitcoin. We'll also investigate how geopolitics and power games shape the world we live in, but also what can we learn from history to understand the present and prepare for the future. I hope you will get fresh insight and enjoy this conversation. If you do, as always, please give it a like and subscribe, but also leave your actions down below in the comment section and share it to those who need to hear this. But before I start, I'd like you to know that if you open an account at Gold Republic, you will receive 1 free gram of gold worth €60 or $50. Just click on the link in the description. Welcome to the Microscopic Podcast, Tuur. It's a pleasure to have you.
Happy to be here, Alexei.
Tuur, one of the first questions I ask my guests usually is a bit of a tradition by now, is what is your most heretical view on the monetary system?
Most heretical view? Wow. I assume in the eyes of normal people. And you're operating in a European context, it would be that the euro is going to disappear in our lifetime a lot sooner than that. I even, in 2012, I believe, I published a report titled The End of the Euro. And I still believe that. 10 years later, I still believe it's not going to last. So maybe that.
Okay, well, it's maybe a good start as well for a conversation. Maybe what can you tell us about what you wrote in that paper in 2012?
Yeah, it was in Dutch for my my newsletter. It's called Macro Trends that I did back then. It was making the argument that all these fiat systems eventually die in a storm of inflation, and that this one was not going to be different. Plus, that there is the additional challenge in Europe, as is widely known, of course, that all these different countries have very different cultures, very different fiscal regimes, very different approaches to how they deal with debt. And so that gradually the South, roughly speaking, was going to want more lenient policy. The North was going to want more austerity. And that is just going to rip things apart. And also looking at the regional cross-country liabilities between banks, for example, just seeing at banks in country X having so many debt obligations to country Y and all, and it's such a huge mess. It just, and maybe it helps also that I remember being a little kid where your like political reality was just Belgium growing up. And I assume maybe for you as well, in the country where you grew up, it was just, I live in France. But then gradually you saw I want to call it propaganda. You saw more posters and they were pushing for like EU and Europe. And And so it very much, in my opinion, is an artificial construct, this whole political union. And I think that under pressure, this union is going to fall apart. And to an extent, that's already happening. And so, we had a Latin monetary union in the 1800s, and even that didn't last under the gold standard. So I just don't see, fiat is such an incredibly volatile, fragile system. I just don't see how that could magically be the glue that holds it all together.
So from a monetary perspective, you said that in our lifetimes, and I'll assume that you live at least until 80, 90, maybe 100 years. So within the next 60 years, we will see the end of the euro, but then would the dollar be also part of that projection?
I mean, I would say 90% chance that we see the end of the euro in the next 20 years. I think it's we already, I mean, we haven't seen a country exit that is on the euro. We've seen a country exit that was part of the union, but not part of the eurozone with the UK. I think more exits are going to come. The end of the euro, I think the dollar is going to last longer just because it has, there's a bit that Lindy effect, like it's been around for a lot longer, so probably it'll last longer. But it's going to face very, very serious issues. I look at it a little bit more like how, you look at the Catholic Church, where it's been around for so long, but its power has changed. 500 years ago, the power was almost absolute, especially in the Romanic speaking countries in Europe. And then gradually that diminished, and now it's still around, but it just doesn't mean that much anymore. And so I feel that the dollar similarly, as a symbol, it's probably going to be preserved. The way the dollar works might change, but it's a strong brand, so they might try and keep it. Just like how many incarnations of the peso have there been in Latin America? They don't rebrand, they do the opposite. They build a new product and then they try to sell it under the same brand. So I think that could happen with the dollar.
Mm-hmm. More or less that works. And if we look at, for example, you just mentioned that, there's also like a great chart that illustrates how the euro just in the last 2-3 years lost its share of international settlement in terms of, for example, referring to the de-dollarization. It actually is a de-euroization in the last years. And it is indeed like kind of like a locked mechanism where we've seen, for example, with Greece or Italy having like massive deficits, public deficits that now are going north, like more than 200% public debt to GDP. And so it kind of begs to ask about the nature of fiat as well, right? Because this is just the symptom. But the root cause is fiat, right? As a mechanism, as a way of making that whole system work or not work. So what do you think is the three biggest pitfalls of that system?
I mean, first of all, I think it's rather understandable that we ended up with the fiat system, because not that I defend it, I think it's a flawed system, but I think it's kind of understandable how it happened, because the world was really globalizing very rapidly with the Industrial Revolution, especially in the 1800s. And then there was another boost to that with digitization, where everything just went, on a second's notice. And I understand that there was a need for a digital type money, that it was difficult to settle transactions directly in gold, and we saw that with the Second World War, where so many gold holdings were either confiscated or they had to like flee away real quickly, and then that kind of gave a political advantage to the US, for example, where they were holding all of a sudden a lot of the gold of the world. And I remember, of course, I don't remember, but in terms of, historically, it makes me think of like General de Gaulle, who like caught up with that, as like, hey, like, we're giving them gold and we're getting back paper. Like, let's get the gold back. And so it just created tension, because countries were, it was hard to keep your own gold. in a globalized world. So I think it's understandable we moved on to a kind of digital form, but I mean, of course, it is just too tempting to have digital money and not just create it out of thin air and have that completely get out of control. And that's what's been happening in the last couple decades. Like monetary expansion has just gone totally out of control. So to me, that's the core flaw, is that there is no limit. There's absolutely no limit to how many monetary tokens can be created. And then you get, of course, the Cantillon effect, where whoever receives those monetary tokens first, they get to spend the money as if it's strong, and whoever receives that new money last, like usually people who have a fixed wage, like blue collar workers, they end up holding the short stick, the bag, basically, because by the time they receive the money, it's worth a lot less. So people who are close to the banking system, that's why, you know, we have that, people have that jaded feeling towards Wall Street and the bankers, and because they kind of sense, they don't always understand intellectually, but people kind of sense that there's something wrong with how much money there is, and that's the Cantillon effect, right? It's because they receive the money just when it's created, and of course governments as well. When they borrow money, they issue bonds, and then they get to spend cash, and that cash as well is inflationary. That's also new money that gets pumped in the system. And so, yeah, when people look at Brussels, the culture of Brussels, and I mean in Europe, and how all that government money gets spent, that's also like, there's, you know, and unfortunately people call that capitalism, right? They say like, oh, capitalism is bad because look at all these excesses. It's like, well, I sympathize, but I think what you're actually saying is that the fiat system is bad. Like, it's not bad for people to run businesses and make money. But so, yeah, maybe that's the third thing, right? I mean, there's money creation out of thin air. There's the Cantillon effect. And then the third, maybe negative side of the fiat system, I would say, is the disequilibrium it creates in the economy. It really it misallocates resources everywhere, because the price of money gets distorted. Like, instead of the market creating a price for money, which is the interest rate, comes just out of natural transactions that people have in the market. And then based on that, you would have a price for borrowing. If I want to install a swimming pool, or if I want to do things, that would give me a correct signal. But by artificially manipulating that price of money, all kinds of weird things are happening. And that's why, you know, it sounds weird, but that's why new houses are a lot poorer quality. That's why maybe even the food supply has been contaminated and gone down in quality. That's why so many of the billionaires today have made their money focusing on consumer goods, very simple consumer goods. Like, I mean, Amazon, as brilliant as it is as a company, it's mostly just selling goods that people are going to consume right away, instead of building the infrastructure, which is, in a higher interest rate environment, you have more incentive to invest in infrastructure, things that are going to last a long time. That's not really where the big money has been made. Like, we don't have like oil barons so much anymore, and we even had a bear market in commodities and gold, right? I mean, like, all those things have been artificially suppressed in favor of spending now and not thinking about tomorrow, because that's what the price of money tells us. Money has been, at least until the last 3 years, dirt cheap. It was zero interest rate almost. So anyway, so that is, you know, a pet peeve of mine, is that there's been incredible distortions to the economy, and it's creating poverty, and it's creating just all kinds of problems around the world. I think it's even hard to imagine how pervasive this problem is and how severe the consequences are.
Yeah, I think you made me think about all those things, like in this mini rant, and I really see what you mean, because it's not just money, it's not just the saving in inflation. It's just, as you said, is the quality of things is diluted, just as the value in of itself, which actually we call money, but it hasn't, like, if you really want to go into semantics, is not money, it's currency. And big sound money advocates would tell you the same, I guess. So it's actually currency that we kind of like think is money, and we're being trapped thinking it's money, but that money is losing its value. And it's actually also just eroding the base of a system. And it's easy to go into kind of, and that's what I don't like usually, this doom thinking. And when I kind of tell my friends or people around me what I feel I see or what I hear from experts like you, is that things are not doing that well. And there's just like this big investment from all kinds of parties that have an interest in this system to maintain the facade quite acceptable. But behind that is just a big pile of crap that is decaying, and people kind of smell it, but they can't see it, right? And so, sorry.
There is an author, a Dutch author, Harry Mulisch, and I've never read the book myself, but I heard a friend of mine talk about it. And in one of his books, he has this image of a golden wall, and it's basically this idea that regular people are on one side of the golden wall, and they hear about the magical things that happen behind it, like, oh, people are making the laws and they're figuring out how to do banking, and and then once you climb on top of the wall and you actually see what's going on, you're like, oh my God, this is so bad. And that is something that's why there is so much inertia in society, because people, you are quite humble in nature. Like, people assume I'm not an expert, I don't know. They probably, the experts, the journalists, the doctors, they probably know what they're doing. And so it's only once things get really, really bad that people are like, come on, like, let's get on the wall and see what's really going on. And then you have the outrage, of course. But sorry, I interrupted.
No. I mean, it was more of like a side comment about that. But still, there's then this type of, I would say, just collective loss of memory in a way, because that's kind of like history, what history is. And history has taught us many things. And you could say that history has been written by the winners and by the victorious. That's maybe true. But there's in many accounts, no matter victorious or defeated, that facts are facts. Facts, the fact that money dies, the fact that revolutions exist. And I think it's really like now that I feel in a pivotal moment of where systems change are going to be radical, where society at large is through either votes or through maybe like the way the financial system is constructed, or just how people are socially interacting with each other, or just about people as individuals, who are you and how are you developing yourself or not. And I would like to know about you, like, how do you see that? How do you think we're like in a paradigm shift? And if yes, how does it manifest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are moving towards a situation where most people will have very little left to lose. Because often, like, why is there inertia in society? Is people are afraid to lose what they have. But when inflation is that bad, or when you have, like in Argentina, they had Corralito, where it's like you have a bank holiday and you can't even get to your money. When those kind of things start to happen, people have very little left to lose, and that you can already feel the pain. You see all these little social media videos, and of course, we know people in our own families and friends who are starting to struggle financially, because this inflation, it's not just the Ukraine war that's pushing up the energy prices. Like German businesses and German heavy industry has to work with electricity prices, with energy prices that are 6 times higher than those in the United States right now, right? And that is because of policy, that is because of inflation, because of taxes, because of all kinds of things. The industrial base of Europe is thoroughly undermined, and so the pain is starting to increase, and it's almost, I'm afraid it's going to increase almost exponentially. Like it's going to be like that graph in Weimar Germany, where things seemed normal, even close to the beginning of the hyperinflation. Things seemed pretty normal, and then all of a sudden it went really fast, because it's just how going bankrupt works. Like, once the trust is lost, then it goes very fast. So yeah, I think it's kind of telling, right? Because you said history is written by the victors. I think in many ways the victors of the past 100 years have been governments, because of the fiat system, they are able to extract so much economic capital from the economy that we are almost. It's sad, right? In Europe, you're living in a museum. You every day you see the what was a glorious time, right? What real wealth was being created and incredible beauty. And then you see at the same time, it's not happening anymore. They're not building those buildings anymore. There's not, Rodin isn't. Where's Rodin, right? I mean, where's where's, and not to get into, there's tastes, of course, and these things, but there is an element there where there's been an erosion. And so I do believe, I think actually we've already seen what something like a revolution in Argentina recently, like that is an example of like people being like, look, I have nothing left to lose. I'm going to vote for this guy who's not part of the system and who's actually is promising to do something really different. And of course it's tricky, right? I mean, I think what Milei is planning to do, I hope he succeeds, is actually the way to go, is just to say, look, rule of law, minimal government, we're going to cut all the spending, go back on a sound money standard, very, very simple things. But of course, when people are really very emotional, nothing left to lose, and there's a risk as well that you go towards communism or you go towards fascism. And so it's volatile. It's going to be a volatile time. I think Europe is just not yet ready to go for really radical options. But already, like in Belgium, I mean, I'm seeing literal communists on television saying, promoting books that are advocating for confiscating all the wealth of any person who has more than €1 million, just like that, and capping all the pensions at 200,000 euros. I mean, that is just, I mean, you can be a political moderate or whatever, but like when you're talking about plain confiscation of people's savings, in my book, that is communism. And I'm not trying to like go on a whole rant about which political system is the best one. I'm just saying people are having less and less to lose, and we're going to see more and more radical politics as a result of that. So yes, this is just like, in the 1700s, late 1700s, first you had hyperinflation with the assignats in France, and then you had the French Revolution. And so, yeah, I think I'm waiting for inflation first, and then there's going to be big changes.
When Money Dies perfectly actually resumes that. I've had the audiobook, and I think it's astonishing. Obviously, history rhymes, but not always, unfolds as it used to be. But it's funny to see the funny or sad, depending on how you see it, maybe both, to see how things can unravel in a similar way. Talking about
and I mean, it's sad. Yeah, yes, it's sad, but also it has to happen, right? Just like how you need a hangover after you've been drinking, something needs to happen to get rid of all the debt. And of course, let's hope we can get through that in a peaceful manner, because usually even hyperinflations, like people think of it as like nuclear war, but like a hyperinflation, it's like a forest fire. It just cleans the system. There's a study, an IMF study about hyperinflations, and in Latin America and in developing countries, they tend to last longer. But in Europe, the history shows that it usually only lasts 1 to 2.5 years. So it's actually a relatively brief period. Anyway, I'm not saying I want it to happen, but things are so unsustainable. We need inflation to get the debt is just too much. Like something has to happen to get rid of all the debt. It's just too much.
And to your point, if you compare then the forest fires, Nassim Taleb also kind of wrote it in his book, Anti-Fragile, I think, is that forest fires are natural occurrences, but the thing is that if they do not occur, bigger ones unfold, and they are much more destructive than the small ones. So we should embrace the small ones, and if we want to maybe bring it back to the monetary system as a whole, we need those cleanses, just as, for example, we do fasting, intermittent fasting, or fasting in general. If you look at every religion, there's fasting in it, and it's for a reason, because it resets the body. I did a three-day water fast recently. Unbelievable.
Oh, great.
It's astonishingly difficult. I really felt absolutely shit, sorry for my French, but it was then a renewal. It's like you're shedding your old skin, and maybe it's the same way as that we are averting pain, we are delaying pain, just like this massive painkiller, and we're not ready to embrace things. We just want the best of things without having to pay the price, yet we want to basically consume without producing either. So it's really like this big disconnect. And
yeah, and I think that it's, again, with that image of the wall, right? I mean, I think actually a lot of people are perfectly capable of taking some pain. And there used to be, throughout history, you would have economic panics. They would call them panics. And they would last about a year, something like that. It wouldn't actually be felt in all of the economy. Usually it was like a stock market phenomenon. Prices went down. Unemployment wouldn't even rise that much. And so they would call them panics. But it's only in the 20th century that they started talking about the business cycle. And like, oh, you get this protracted period, and like, ooh, we could get a depression. And so they, there was a lot of rhetoric to like say like, oh yeah. And of course people don't know because they didn't live decades ago. Like I when I was born, the era of panics was long over. And so we have to kind of read in history books to see how that actually went. But so we just listen to these authorities that are like, yeah, of course we need to, crank down interest rates because we need to stimulate the economy because otherwise we might have a crash. It's like, but like you're saying, they're making it way, way worse by every time postponing the inevitable. They're making it way, way worse. There's a saying that suppressed volatility leads to hypervolatility, and that's what this is, right? And it's already baked into the cake. We're gonna get this hyper volatility, and individual people luckily can do a lot to prepare for it. But on a macro level, it's gonna be tough for a while.
So inflation is the future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's no way. The only reason why inflation right now is low is because oil production is through the roof. There's so much oil being produced. I was kind of shocked to see in the US, oil production is now double that of 2006. Like, so in that short amount of time, oil production doubled. So it's temporary. We just have a temporary relief, but it's going to come back with a vengeance, just like in the 70s. It comes in waves.
And for you, the main driver is the money supply, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean, there's supply and demand, of course, and so I think that we've been living in this era of the everything bubble. Like there's been the .com bubble and the real estate bubble, and then of course stock market bubble, and then of course what people were not talking about was there was an enormous bubble in government bonds, the bond bubble. And in 2021, I feel like for the first time, we had like a mania that you saw, like you were talking about Bernholz, right? Like the When Money Dies, I think that's Ferguson. But so, yeah, I think both of them describe these periods of mania, right? In a time period where there's also hyperinflations and very high inflations, and it's very closely correlated. But so in 2021, we had like another huge bubble, and it was almost like everything went into a bubble. Because of the massive COVID stimulus, of course, and what I'm getting at is that I think because the bubbles are showing up faster and faster, and they are changing in nature. Like it's not always internet stocks, right? It goes from one thing to the next. And so people get more and more confused about what they need to do with their money. And so sometimes temporarily, they park it into the euro, they park it into the dollar, and then you have these periods where inflation goes down. Because temporarily people they kind of hold their breath and they kind of want to see what's next. Not because they believe in it for the long term, but just temporarily. And so that's what I think explains that phenomenon. And eventually people will find safe havens that will actually work for the long term. And that's going to be commodities, it's going to be gold, it's going to be Bitcoin. Assets that are scarce that are liquid, so easily saleable around the world, and assets that have relatively low counterparty risk, so that you don't have to trust a banker to store it for you. I think that's been my thesis for the last 15 years. Those are the assets you want to hold when this inflationary depression starts. And in my opinion, it has already begun. Like I know everyone is debating, like, are we in a recession? Are we not? I believe we absolutely are. And this is the beginning of, who knows, hopefully it won't be a decade, but I want to say at least 5 years of pain, maybe 7, of stagflation at least, right? High inflation, stagnation, but more likely an economic depression.
Okay, so that's I have this as the next question. Actually, there was exactly that. Also about the Fed play, about the fact that now, like we're recording this interview on the 20th of December, just for timely context. And Jerome Powell gave in its last FOMC meeting kind of a hint that they will be cutting rates as of next year, kind of contradicting all the previous meetings where they said they would keep rates higher for longer, and thereby like markets getting excited, Bitcoin also profiting from that excitement, stocks as well. Gold has also been picking up, but gold has been actually steadily increasing even though rates were high, so that's also quite odd, right? So everything points towards the fact that we're moving from the most anticipated recession in history of 2023, which was the beginning of the year, to the most anticipated cutting rates. I mean, I'm just saying this now. Maybe it's maybe wrong. I don't know. Into next year, and the most anticipated thereby bull run. And I'm curious because in my groups I'm following, everyone is very bullish. Everyone thinks it's the next bull run. It's the start of the next bull run, and we're gonna make lots of money now. But you're just saying that we might just enter a big period of hardship. And so how does that compute?
Yeah. Well, I've been arguing that the spectacles that we're wearing, the glasses that we're wearing to look at the economy, we have to change, because you can no longer put on euro glasses or dollar glasses to look at the economy, because it distorts everything. You know, the denominator is broken. The denominator is poisoned. So we need to look at markets with different glasses. And what I've been doing for the last 5, 6, well, actually for the last 10 years, but it's working increasingly well, is I express my long-term charts in the CRB index, which is just a commodity index. So basically I denominate my charts when I look at the markets in commodities. And that, to me, that is what goes up and down with purchasing power. And that's what I'm interested in. I don't really care about the euro or the dollar. Like, I'm not invested in them. I just want to know, can I buy the same amount of gas? Can I buy the same amount of groceries? Like, if I stay steady in commodities, I'm pretty happy. And so when you look at markets that way, we are already in a bear market. The parabolic, which was crazy if you imagine, like, we had a parabolic rise in stock market values expressed in commodities because that was the bear market, a rise, and then that just broke down with in 2021, when we saw all of a sudden lumber was so expensive, and then gradually oil also followed later. And so what we're going to see, my thesis is, yeah, sure, dollar values are going to go up, housing prices are going to go up, stock markets, it's all going to go up. And yet people are going to make more videos that they cannot pay the bills. They have a full-time job and they cannot even pay for the car, you know, or to heat their homes. And that's going to continue. And the reason is that the stock markets expressed in commodities are in a, not even recession, are in a depression, are going to go down 50% or more. That is what's going to happen, because we need a revaluation of all these commodities, because the world economy needs to go back to basics, because we're broke. We don't have money. We can't in the aggregate, people cannot afford to book the next vacation, and because the pension funds that they think they have is empty. It's just a bunch of government debt promises that are sitting there. Pension funds are not stacks of gold, they are just empty paper promises. And that's just pensions. Same goes for insurance companies. Same goes for unemployment checks. Like that's also just government promises. So the world is broke, except we're not realizing it yet. And that's why we need to go back to basics. And that's why once this whole thing starts to correct, commodities are going to be the most valuable place. And I do believe in that it's going to include precious metals, because those are the building blocks to start from scratch. That's how you build a simple house. That's how you heat your home, is you fire up some oil or wood or whatever it is. That's how commodities is also like literal grains and beef, like the things that you need to feed your body. So that's what needs to be emphasized. There, we need the investments to go there and no longer be distracted by all these gizmos and goodies and electronics and whatnot that we think is so important that we've been investing in them for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. So the real economy, basically.
The real economy.
Yeah.
Or at least the foundation of a real economy. Because that's, it's all fine to have nice interior walls and beautiful paintings, but you need a foundation into your building, and that's what's lacking now.
And maybe a good idea, you didn't mention it per se, I think. I mean, you did, but I think if you look at housing, which is maybe for the base as a sedentary life, as species we are, is the most overvalued thing that we maybe as a first investment in our lifetime. I want to buy a house, but I can't because it's just from a generational perspective, it's the most expensive it's ever been. Even though my salary is, let's say, on a pro rata, maybe bigger than, let's say, 10 years ago, whatever. I just cannot afford it.
There's a global wealth report. I forget who wrote it. One of these consultancy companies put together a global wealth report, and in it they argued that over 50% of global wealth is now invested in real estate. And of course, that was not always the case at all. Over 50%. And the reason why this is the case is the Cantillon effect we talked about earlier, because the way that governments have been organizing how the money gets into the economy has been very heavily favoring mortgages. So borrowing money to build a house, to buy a house, etc. And of course, it's governments love that, because the more wealth people have tied up in something that is local, the more easy it is to keep taxing them and raise taxes and all those kind of things. And so it's kind of they're stimulating growth in this one area, and then at the same time, it's very easy to keep taking the cream off the top, like taking profits in terms of taxes. So that's why, in my opinion, real estate is so incredibly overvalued. And you can find long-term charts that show this. For example, there's the Herengracht index in.
I'm literally in the Herengracht right now.
Oh wow, wonderful!
In the Gouden Bocht, in the former headquarters of the Deutsche Bank. We have a vault downstairs, so doesn't get better than this in the context.
Fantastic! Yeah. Well, I wish I was there because it's such a beautiful city. But
next time you come to Amsterdam, you come definitely visit here. I'll invite you for coffee.
I would love to. Yeah, I would love to. And so, yeah, I mean, that is an area that has been highly sought after. Like, people want to live there. People want to have their businesses there. It's really at the heart of the Netherlands. And so it was always a well-to-do neighborhood. And the prices go back to I believe, at least 1600s, maybe earlier than that. And so you see this index, and it was like relatively flat, and, it fluctuated a little bit. And then all of a sudden, in euro terms or in guilder terms, it went up a lot, but expressed in actually also in gold. In gold terms, it kept going up, and so that's how you see that even on a 500-year scale, real estate is incredibly overvalued right now, and so it's a little bit hard for regular people to understand how it all works, and it's unfortunate because people do have the right instinct. They think, look, I invest in something real, in bricks, brick and mortar, and it's real, and you can't just take it away from me. But of course, there are these stories of rent controls in Germany where people would literally pay the value of one apple for a week's rent. Like it would just be so homeowners and landlords especially would be destroyed economically by these crazy policies. So yeah, I would just say in general, people who are invested in real estate, make sure that at least you invest in a hedge. Like, make sure you have a part of your portfolio that's going to go up a huge amount if real estate continues to break down, because of course, expressed in commodities, real estate indexes are already going down.
That this is the core. It's literally the core of a family of this deciding if you get kids. If you don't have a home, usually your propensity of having kids is decreasing.
Yeah, and I acknowledge that we all need a roof over our heads, especially in rainy Amsterdam. But I would just add to consider, for people to consider, is this concept of fungibility, because and that's how you make the difference between, or how you decide the difference between a consumer good and a good that is a production good. There's another word for it, but let's call it a production good. And a consumer good is not fungible. And fungible, it means that you can exchange one for another without even noticing. So, for example, my car is not fungible because I can't just swap it out for another car and my wife won't notice, or I'll be able to do the same things with it. Like, cars they're all different. They have also, they have even the same model of the same car will have differences in how well it's maintained, what it needs, the mileage, features, all kinds of things, the smell, who knows? That's all non-fungibility. And so the same is true with houses, even more than with a car, because it's fixed, it's immobile, immobilian. So it's immobile, it's fixed in place in one location. And it has very, very different characteristics. And so, of course, if the economy changes and all of a sudden you have to move from the center of the city to the edge of the city, well, you're going to have to sell your house. You can't take it with you. And something that I think a lot of people don't consider is that the energy footprint, I don't mean for climate, I just mean for the cost of keeping the house warm. If it's a recently built house, and if the house was built in good times when everything was cheap, maybe the windows are very thin. Maybe the window surface is way too big compared to what you need. Maybe the bedroom is way too big, and so as people's needs change, and they can change quickly, that can have a huge effect on prices in particular neighborhoods. Like, I remember going to Spain. I drove around in Spain for my newsletter, doing research into the real estate market in 2011. So after the real estate crash there. And you could just see entire neighborhoods sitting empty, blowing in the wind, and especially newly built houses. Once you don't touch them for a year, they are teardowns. You have to just bulldoze them and start over, because people don't build with the same quality they used to anymore. Anyway, I'm just like passing it along because I know a lot of people, understandably, are very attached to real estate, but these are really historic times. And so I would say at the least think about
so don't invest in real estate. Just don't buy a house now.
I mean, especially, if you're younger, I would say absolutely.
Wait.
Don't even think about it.
Yeah.
And even just do the math. Just do the math. And when you think about buying a house, consider not only the money you would spend now versus the money you would spend on renting, but also consider the money that you spend on the house now that you otherwise could invest in a portfolio of assets that will maintain their value and grow. Like, I mean, for me, of course, the equation is often, I think about Bitcoin. Like, what if, but I'm spending $30,000 more now, 30,000 euros more now, but I own this apartment. It's like, yes, that's true. And on paper, it looks like you will spend less euros in the future, but consider how much more that 30,000 can buy you now for your investment account, for your gold or Bitcoin or things that are going to help you in 10 years from now. So that's because the bricks aren't going to do it. The bricks are going to be flat or down. I would argue they're guaranteed to go down. So anyway, and also consider maybe that historically speaking, actually most people would just rent their house. It's not a shame to rent a house. Like in Victorian Great Britain, which was arguably one of the wealthiest, one of the most literate, most cultured society we've ever seen, only 10% of people own their own home. So it's not a shame to say I save my money in hard money and I'm going to just shop around because things are changing, and then maybe later I'll buy a home. There is no shame in that, I would argue.
There were some very rich landlords back then.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit more of a, but even that, it was a business, right? You run it as a business because you would always, gold would naturally deflate over time, right? So only if you believe that you could outperform gold, would you become a real estate business person.
Mm-hmm. So now coming back to the commodity basket that you use to track all that, Bitcoin is part of it? Actually
not. No, the CRB index has been around since the 1950s. And so I like it because it's just a ticker symbol. And so it's easy to make charts with it.
So why wouldn't there be an index where Bitcoin is part of it?
I feel like Bitcoin doesn't necessarily track, because it has that steep adoption curve still. You know, it goes up so much in the bull periods that I just think it doesn't really reflect everyday living expenses. It doesn't really track, you know, the gradual devaluation of the euro, for example. And so I feel like commodities are more intuitive and they make more sense because literally I put petroleum in my car and literally I eat beef. And so then the commodity index tracks the prices of those things, of course, in the wholesale market, not in the retail level.
Mm-hmm. So Luke Gromen talks about fire alarms. And you just mentioned gold and commodities, and Bitcoin is also part of it. But there's also something that you wrote in your report of the report that you actually started publishing, I think, in 2013, right? It's been more than 10 years. I think you did this for every year, and then you did a bit of a break for a few years, I think, about the upcoming Bitcoin boom. And in that report, you mentioned that there's a correlation between, in general, like the M2 money supply and Bitcoin in of itself. So that report is how to position for the Bitcoin boom. And my question is, since Bitcoin is only there since, let's say, 2009, and we've been only so far living a monetary expensive trend, what will happen to Bitcoin if, and that's kind of like the thesis that, for example, Greg Foss says, it's never going to happen, Alex, it's never going to happen, that we will live in a monetary retraction where contraction, sorry, not retraction, contraction.
Sure. Like a liquidity crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the reports. My first one was 2012, and I've every bear market of Bitcoin, every Bitcoin bear market, I've put out a report because then I feel like it's the most important to revisit the whole thesis, and then, you know, if I am optimistic, to also share that with the world. So yeah, my last report was published in April. It's free, and it's called How to Position for the Bitcoin Boom. And so the big contraction, I think this is basically the only thesis that people who are bullish on bonds have, right? It's like, oh, there's going to be a big squeeze, and then bonds are going to go up a lot. And what would happen with Bitcoin? So basically, maybe a simple way to put it is like, what if 2008 repeated, right? What would happen to Bitcoin? Right? Because I think a similar scenario would happen to what happened to gold. Gold sold off briefly, and then it recovered, and it massively exceeded its previous highs. We had a bull market for the next 2-3 years in gold. So I feel like similar thing would happen, because what happens in a deflationary, I don't like this word, the deflationary crisis.
Why not?
It makes it seem like inflation goes away. Like I feel like it's more like a bankruptcy event or something. Like a lot of businesses are folding. A lot of people who are levered up all of a sudden need liquidity, need cash. And so because Bitcoin is extremely liquid, as is gold, those tend to be the first things that people sell off to try and prevent bankruptcy, like because they get a capital call, they get a margin call, and so they just liquefy whatever they can. Their real estate is frozen up in that time. They cannot sell their real estate; it's all frozen. So yeah, that's why I think Bitcoin as well. It would decline periodically, like briefly, for maybe, it's hard to say. But I feel like increasingly such a scenario is less interesting because I mean the US government alone, for example, is now already spending more on merely paying the interest on their debt than it's spending on its entire military budget. And that's the biggest military in the world. So this is just completely unsustainable. And that's why the Fed has been so dovish. That's why they're lowering interest rates, because they're literally murdering the government. If they raise the interest rates more, they're killing them. And they're not going to do that. They're part of the system. Same for the ECB, right? I mean, if they try to be very austere, the governments are going to just get out of the euro. So yeah, I just think it's just less of a concern than it used to be. There's of course always volatility in Bitcoin. That's why I put out these reports, because Bitcoin tends to go down 70-80% in the bear market. But we already saw that. We went from 65,000 all the way down to 16,000. That was the previous cycle. And then I put out my report at about 26,000, and now we're at 40,000, 41,000. I think, yeah, we could see a correction. We could go down to 30 again. But it's still an early bull market. And by the way, I believe gold is in an early bull market as well. The 2000 level, we're going to break above that. Yeah. I feel like the gold at 2000, and now Bitcoin is a bit early. Bitcoin tends to have like people that are a bit more just eager to go. But once gold breaks out, I think it'll coincide with the dovish global financial policy of like crank open the switch on the printing presses and just let the liquidity flood. That is going to be the gold rally. We're going to go to 5,000, of course. I mean, the only question is, how much is the dollar going to be worth once we hit these milestones of $5,000 and $10,000 dollar gold? It just, that's why you might want to look at gold expressed in commodities to really see like what is it doing for you as a saver, right? That's a fun one.
Do you believe that in this type of system, governments and central banks have gold on the balance sheet? They would allow gold to do a 2x if they really like 2.2x if they really reach like $5,000 an ounce, if gold reaches that level.
They're not magicians. They can't make more gold. And at some point, if they try to manipulate the system, I know that we had the Gata reports, and those guys were really on the money to see what was going on with the shenanigans in the London gold market, and having multiple claims on the same physical gold, and the fact that the Federal Reserve hasn't been audited since 1953 and all that stuff. Yeah, they can try to create more gold claims than there is actually gold, and thereby suppress the price. But eventually, people are going to call bluff and just do like the Hunt brothers and say, just deliver me physical. I don't even care about your futures anymore. Just bring it to me. I want physical. And that's going to just crack open that whole market. And then we'll see. We'll see what kind of manipulation was really going on. And maybe gold has been massively suppressed and undervalued. But yeah, so I just think there's limits to because also once mutiny breaks out, the people that used to have a lot of power all of a sudden worry about their own skin, and we saw that in Russia, for example, when the USSR started to collapse. There was so much inflation. It was that's why Yeltsin was not really powerful, because he couldn't get tax money to go to Moscow. They would raise taxes. That's crazy to read about that stuff. There was just, the inflation was so bad that they would start taxing the provinces in kind, so that you would, for example, pay taxes as a building company by constructing a metro system for your city. And then the stuff that went to Moscow, they would say, oh, we're going to put it in a big container and we'll ship it to you. So it would just be a bunch of stuff that would arrive in Moscow.
It's like almost barter.
The bureaucrats there had to then like try to sell it. And like they literally sent them sometimes chemical waste as like a way to say, I mean, it wasn't even a fuck you. It was just kind of like, we just,
that's all we got.
Everything. It's like everything is so difficult because it literally, money is the blood of the economy, and you're getting anemia, or you're getting an immune disorder. That is what hyperinflation is. It's like everything stops working. And so that applies to government too. So whatever powers we think they have now, that's going to really change. I'm not saying it's going to be fantastic and this and that, but some of the more dramatic fears that people have, like, oh, but the government's like, yeah, but think of the government the way it's going to be, which is going to be a bunch of people that are in disarray, that are fighting with each other, that have trouble even raising money. We're going to have all kinds of career bureaucrats and who even struggle to get paid themselves, like policemen. There's going to be a massive rise in corruption because policemen are not going to get, a decent paycheck anymore. So anyway, just, I think my best case scenario is like Argentina. All things considering, I mean, of course, you're not looking at the period of the dictatorship. Like, it was weirdly a relatively functional society for the last 20 years, even though they had massive bouts of inflation. That's kind of my wish, like that we get through this in this kind of Argentine way, and then get our shit together a bit later on.
Well, there's been also the Venezuelan scenario, or
well, that's more grim.
Zimbabwe,
because that feels more like that's more like towards communism, where there's just everything is becoming. Who knows? You can argue gradations, right? I'm not saying the Argentines had it easy by any stretch, because it's been going on for a long, long time, and poverty rates are crazy high there. But I mean, in terms of at least avoiding, African-style dictatorships, it's maybe not the worst. And it's more like kleptocracy.
Yeah. And you see as well that maybe, like, what you say is that the inevitable will basically leave those governments crumbling in a way, but you also see that those maybe authorities that have their vested interests are trying to develop mechanisms just as means of controls, like CBDCs or just surveillance technology through big tech and so on and so forth, things that are documented and that they're not even conspiracy at all. They're just facts at this point, to try to safeguard those interests and to put a veil on all that.
And that's why the world is splitting in half. At least that's how I see it. Like, Bitcoin is basically it's like Bitcoin is saying the emperor has no clothes. Like, it used to be like, oh, but fiat currencies we're so special. We all have our own, bills and whatever. And with the advent of Bitcoin, all of a sudden everybody can create 10 new currencies in a day. And we literally have over 20,000 cryptocurrencies all over the world. And so people are less attached now to their national currency because they realize, like, this is actually, it's not so special anymore. Yes, I agree that they CBDC is their kind of Hail Mary to try and save the system. To me, that reminds me of the Spanish Empire when they clung to this God-given power, so to speak, from the Vatican and from the Catholic Church. They really clung to that, and they were very controlling and very bullying, and very severe punishments towards even their own merchant fleet and things like that. And then, of course, the Spanish Inquisition is very, very well known. But ultimately, they just made themselves poor. Like, they were the wealthiest nation in the world. They were the biggest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. Well, not true, but the biggest empire then. And yet, in a century, they just all ruined it for themselves. Whereas other countries that had more tolerance, were more open for commerce, had freedom of religion, they thrived, like the Netherlands and then later New York and those areas. So that's how I see the world, evolving, is that certain countries are going to double down and condemn themselves to poverty, and other countries are going to choose freedom of currency, freedom of money, and are going to actually have real money. And like you were pointing out, like, money needs the component of store of value for the long term. And so the countries that go that path are going to do very well.
So we have gold and we have Bitcoin. and we have silver, but let's say just for the sake of simplicity, we have gold and Bitcoin, and some say gold, Bitcoin is the digital gold. That's one assumption. Some others say Bitcoin is digital cash, as mentioned in the white paper from Satoshi Nakamoto. But on one hand, you could say gold is made by nature through nature. It's naturally scarce. Yes, you could potentially see it on an asteroid and start mining that, but we're not there yet. It's a big assumption yet. But that's supposedly the threat for gold is that, and also the fact that it's not movable, but it's physical. Everybody knows what gold is, and when you touch it, the magic of gold, and I can say it for myself, being first a Bitcoin, I'm coming from the cryptocurrency community and Bitcoin environment since 2017, and I came into gold later on, and when I saw gold, when I touched it, it's really cheesy to say, it does something to you. And that's the physical realm, which Bitcoin will never have because it is digital, and it's also man-made. It's artificial. It's by the art, or rather the science of mathematics and code. But it's an extension of a human engineering. And in one way, I see a beauty in Bitcoin, but I also want to know what are the pitfalls? What are the things that we are not knowing yet? We know the known things, and we might know some things we don't know, but maybe there are more not knowns, so to say. And I want to be critical about it as well, because I feel like in the Bitcoin community, especially, there's too much of this Bitcoin fixes that, Bitcoin fixes this. And I feel like it keeps it on I wouldn't say superficial, but too general, simplified way. And I would really like to know from you, what do you think about that, what I just said, but also how do you see like the weaknesses or the things that we really need to address with Bitcoin as sun money in and of itself, as a nature of sun money, and some people even call it a commodity, thereby also my past question.
Bitcoin is concerned, first of all, I do think there's an argument to be made that Bitcoin was discovered because it is extremely difficult to create scarcity in a digital context. It was an unsolved problem for decades, and Satoshi did finally figure out something, and it's something that exists in a very narrow design space. Like there's only so many changes you could make to the variables to still make Bitcoin work. So anyway, just that as a side, that you could really argue that Bitcoin has been discovered rather than just engineered. And then, yeah, I mean, I've been studying Bitcoin for 12 years now, and I still very much want to avoid this survivor's bias, where it's like, oh, I won the lottery, therefore I'm a genius, right? That kind of thing. Or like, I bet on this horse, therefore this horse is always going to win, or something like that. I'm a Bitcoiner, therefore Bitcoin can never go away, or I really want to avoid that kind of arrogance. So that's part of my project. That's the research that I do, is to always try and question the assumptions and go over my homework and try to see if I missed something. And that's part of why, occasionally I did invest in some Bitcoin adjacent projects that were kind of backups, or like they also had proof of work, but then they did it slightly different. And it's only been the last few years that I've really been more comfortable focusing just on Bitcoin, that I really feel like it's this is the one, this is here to stay. And yeah, as far as risk factors go, I believe the biggest risk factor for Bitcoin is basically the understanding of people who use it, and the values of the people who use it. Because if people start to believe it's like, oh, we don't need to run our own nodes anymore, like who does that? Like it's so tedious. You have to like download the software and run the whole node. If enough people start abandoning that, and all of a sudden the amount of nodes in the world, like a full node is basically somebody who really talks to the Bitcoin network and who independently lets the software verify all the transactions, and then who also downloads a full copy of the entire ledger of the history of all the Bitcoin transactions. That's a full node. So if people abandon that idea and we end up with maybe, I don't know, 5 companies who run a full node, then censorship starts to become more likely, right? Right now we have way over 50,000 nodes. I think we have maybe 100,000 or something. A lot of nodes are running. But so yeah, so the fewer nodes that are running, and to an extent you can make the same argument about Bitcoin mining, but the economic incentives are so huge there. It just, and also like a 51% attack is actually not as bad. If miners kind of make a coalition and then they have more than half of the network and then they organize an attack, it's ultimately the people that run the nodes that are in power, especially the ones that have a lot of Bitcoin and that also run a node. They are the independent forces that can kind of keep Bitcoin what it is. So that is I know that people like to go into technical rabbit holes of like, oh, but what if quantum computing is like, yeah, sure. If quantum computing happens and they start cracking particular types of cryptography, first of all, the world at large is going to have a real problem because everything is based on like the banking system, and everything is based on regular cryptography. But you could fairly easily, it appears, create a soft fork and allow people to move their Bitcoin to different addresses that are much more protected, even from extremely evolved artificial intelligence or extremely quantum computing, those kind of things. So I'm less worried about technical attacks because every time it can be mitigated, provided that there's that ethos, the cypherpunk ethos, where we value independence, we value not the lack of a need for trust, right? We need to keep. That's why education is important, to keep that alive.
I have one question from the community because I asked some people and they said, and I'm gonna just ask that one if you can answer it. Otherwise, we'll keep it for next time. Do high fees incentivize users to use a single key pair? And if it does, do high fees reduce privacy?
Do high fees incentivize people to use a single key pair? And then if they do that, do they have less privacy? Well, first of all, on the main chain, on the Bitcoin main blockchain, there isn't that much privacy to begin with. Like that, that is the full node environment, right? That what is prioritized there is security of the network and scarcity of the tokens, making sure there's no double spends. And then privacy is something that has to be produced on higher layers of Bitcoin. There's, of course, some things you can do to enhance privacy on the main chain with CoinJoin and other protocols, but ultimately, it's going to have to happen on the higher layers. And so, yeah, you could make that argument. Like technically, if there's very high fees, for example, now we have very high fees because people have been spamming the blockchain, which it's weird because they have to pay for it. So ultimately, it's going to die. It'll end this kind of period. But yeah, I believe that multi-sig transactions or transactions on the main chain that are less private, that are more private, also take up more space. But then if you go to an environment like the Liquid sidechain, all the transactions, I believe, are confidential transactions. And so you won't even see which one is the multi-sig and which one is the single sig, unless I'm misinformed. But in Lightning and in the Liquid sidechain and the other second layer technologies, platforms, protocol layers, privacy is a lot easier. So it's basically a non-issue.
Thanks a lot, Tuur. It's been a pleasure to have you. You're
Great
very
questions.
active. Thank you. On Twitter, and you also have your website on Adamant. Well, I don't know the full...
AdamantResearch.com, yes.
Exactly, where people can get this report we just talked about. Do you have any last words of goodness, of wishes for 2024 for everybody?
I would just say, I guess maybe rather than tell people what to do, I want to say I am very grateful that I'm alive during this period of transition, because yes, it is a difficult time, But when you look back in history at times of incredible creativity and flourishing, that often coincides with very big challenges on a societal level, even like the Renaissance. And so I believe the Renaissance is already beginning. And so I'm just stoked to be alive now. Of course, we can't just be as mindless as we could afford to be in the 1990s, for example, but big changes are happening, and we get to be part of history. It's an incredible time to be alive, I think.
Amen. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Leave your actions down below in the comment section. And if you want to watch more videos, feel free to check the most recent video, but also any other video that we've had published on the channel before. See you next time.